Okay, today is November 17th, 2025, and we're at the Sisters Museum with Jean Wells.
Morning, everybody. I'm very happy to be here and to share some of my family history with you today. And I'm going to start with my mother, whose family in 1847 came from Missouri on the Barlow Road, it was called. But that was the part of the Oregon Trail. And they settled in the Salem-Dallas area, and I guess it would be great-great-great-grandmother was named Angeline, and she married Richard Seitz in 1858 and had 5 children, but only 2 survived. And then Dr. Seitz practiced medicine in Crook County, and that's when Crook County was Jefferson County, Deschutes County, and Crook County. But he was the only doctor. And he also ran sheep on the homestead. And then Angie married Colonel Fremont Smith. Oh, excuse me. Yes, she did. So I just got mixed up reading this. So I can start again.
No, just keep going.
Oh, okay. And she married Colonel Fremont Smith and had one daughter, Lotta Smith, who was my grandmother. We called her Grandma Tot. They lived outside Prineville on a Rimrock wheat ranch, and it was close to where, if you take the road from Prineville to Terrebonne, you go along the Crooked River, and it was right out there. And they had this wheat ranch, and it was an overnight stop for freight teams traveling from Shaniko to Silver Lake by way of Antelope, Grizzly, and Prineville. And he rented the ranch when my grandma was 13, and they moved into town, and then he studied and became a surveyor. So my Grandma Todd was my grandmother, and she had 3 children, and one was my mother. And Grandma married William Morse, and he came to Prineville at 15 from Kansas, and he was one of 6 children. And he went to work at the feed store, and eventually he owned the feed store. And this was my grandpa, who I'm very fond of. And he became a judge in Prineville, and he was a state representative in the state of Oregon. So he was like my person. When I was 2 months old, my mother and I came to Prineville from Sacramento, where I was born, and my dad was in the Army Air Corps, and he was an instructor. And he went to England, and a few months later, his plane was shot down, and he was taken prisoner of war. And he was a prisoner of war for almost 2 years until the war ended. And my early memories are of my grandfather. He and I spent a lot of time together, and he is still probably my favorite person in the whole world. And he also owned the very first car in Prineville, and he was a very motivated person, and he loved to travel, and he and Grandma did a lot of traveling. And then my mother married Cal Butler, and it turns out he was from Redmond. And I don't have as much history about my dad's side of the family, but I know my grandmother, Meta Butler, came from Eagle Point in Southern Oregon. And in 1915, they opened a drugstore in Redmond, and he was the pharmacist at that time. And then during the flu epidemic, he passed away, and my dad was 2 months old. And so Grandma had my dad and then a 3-year-old, and she was by herself, and she hired a pharmacist, kept the store open, and had it for years and years. And when I went to open my store in Sisters, Grandma was 92, and she came over to see the store, and she was the one that taught me how to sew. And Grandma came in, and she says to me, "Oh, Jean, I had a store here in the 30s." And I obviously didn't know that. And so I think it was just meant to be. I could follow in Grandma's footsteps. And I married Fred Wells in 67. And I have two children, Jason, who lives in Portland, and Valerie, who lives here in Sisters. And she now runs the Stitching Post, which was my business. And Jason and Maggie have two children, and then Valerie has three children. So that's my early history. And I moved to Sisters with my husband and the two children, and Jason was 5 and Val was 1, and he was in construction, so he was building houses, and we lived out at Indian Ford Creek. And I can remember having Val in the stroller, and Jason was running along with the dog, and we were on this dirt road going for a walk, and we came around the corner, and I saw the mountains, and I remember just stopping and saying, "I came home, but I didn't know I needed to." And there's something about the mountains that has stayed with me my whole life. When I came to Sisters, I had been teaching for 8 years in the Beaverton School District, teaching home economics, and I'd been head of the department for the whole district in home ec. And I loved teaching. And I found that, it was after I'd had Jason, and I took a year off of maternity leave. And when I came back, it was to a brand new junior high, and they built this beautiful school, and they went with the federal government on a new program called differentiated education, and it meant that students worked at their own rate, and they could all work on different things. And so that summer I was paid to write learning packets, and so I could have 5 kids doing one thing and somebody else doing something else. And I really liked that. Some of the teachers didn't like it very well, but I felt it met the needs of the kids better. And one of the things they'd done was decided we should have boys home ec also. And I remember I had 36 8th grade boys, and we were getting ready to do a unit on sewing, and they were really excited. They like machines, and so, and I don't think they thought of sewing just as a girl thing. They were 8th grade boys. And I was trying to figure out a project for them to make, and I was at the library, and I came across a book from the UK, and it had these big cushions that just had squares sewed together. And, that was patchwork, but the word patchwork people weren't using much in those days. And I thought, well, they'll learn how to cut straight and accurate, and they'll learn how to sew straight. And so that's what they made. They all picked out their own fabrics and made these big cushions, and it turned out really well. And about that time, I saw a picture of a quilt on, it was, somebody had cut up a quilt, and there was one block, maybe this big, as a pillow, sitting on a bench on somebody's front doorstep. And I kept looking at that design and thinking, well, I would have to hand sew those together to get them to fit. I couldn't figure out how to sew it on the sewing machine. And it was months later that one day it dawned on me, if I started with that square in the middle and added a piece of fabric, and then another one, and another one, and another one, that's how I could get a bigger piece. You would have thought I invented it, and it turned out it was it was called Log Cabin, and it was a design that had been done years before, but you know, quilting hadn't been very popular for several years. People were sewing more with double knits, and I liked sewing several pieces of fabric together. There was something about that and creating something new. So I started teaching a class through the community college in Portland that was just called Patchwork. And so when we moved here, I applied to COCC, and so they offered the class in Sisters, and I ended up with 30 people, and it was the largest class they'd ever had. And, you know, I didn't know the difference. I was just excited. And so that's how I started teaching here in Sisters. At the time, I had thought about, you know, applying for jobs in the area to continue teaching home ec, but the kids were younger and I wanted to be home more, and there really weren't any jobs at that point. So I just kind of created my own little job. And trying to find cotton fabrics was really difficult because it was the era of everybody was sewing on knits and double knits mostly. So I would go to Portland, and I had a friend, Pat Reed, who owned Daisy Kingdom. And that's where I had been teaching my adult ed when I was in Portland. So I would get fabric from her and then bring it over here and sell it to the students, and they would use it for their projects. And finally she said, well, Jean, why don't you just open your own store? And I thought, well, I don't know how to do change. I mean, that sounds really silly, but I was a little intimidated by that. And she says, oh, you can learn how to do that. So what I did was took my retirement funds that I'd accumulated, which was $3,200, and she told me names of some vendors where to buy fabric, and one of them was in Portland. And I remember taking the two kids, and we had a station wagon, and we went up to Portland, and the kids crawled around on the shelves while I bought bolts of fabric and filled the whole car, and came home, and that's how I started the store.
So what year was that?
That was 1975. And looking for a place to have the store was difficult because there were 500 people in Sisters, and because the logging had stopped, the economy wasn't the best, and Black Butte Ranch was being built at that time, and so Brooks Resources worked with the city, and they came up with the idea of doing an 1885 theme in Sisters, so they would give people money to make their buildings look Western. And so that's where the Western fronts happened. And we still have that rule in place. It has morphed, though, into different styles of things. But, you know, it still feels more 1880s in Sisters, which I commend us for keeping it going. Mm-hmm. Because that isn't easy when you have a lot of growth
That's what
in a
brings people
community.
in here, though.
Uh-huh. And I found there was a place in the historic Sisters, I don't know what it's called now, it's a Sister Saloon building, but it used to be Hotel Sisters.
Yeah.
The big 2-story yellow building. Mm-hmm. And down on the bottom floor, on the left-hand side when you face the building, there was a long, narrow room, and it was actually just 2 rooms, and it had been rented out to people from time to time, and it was available. It was 10 feet by 14 feet deep. And so that was my space that I started the store in. And the first thing I did was get a 6-foot table to put up in the back to be able to have classes. And I just, I've always just been a teacher at heart, and I think that came from being oldest child growing up in Redmond, and I had 2 younger sisters, and I'm probably considered bossy. But Mom would just put us outside in the summer, and, I would orchestrate everything, and we would just play. But it, being in that building was really special, because now my husband John Keenan, turns out when they redid the building and made it a restaurant, that became the bar. And I was divorced by the time that happened, and John was too, and he came from Portland, and he and I met, and then we've been married now for 38 years. So it's a special place for us.
So is that the point you had to make another building?
Well, eventually, when I was married to Fred, we figured out, he was in construction at that time, how we could do a building. And so we did a building, and it is behind the liquor store, the long yellow building. That was the building that we built. And I had a store in there for about 5 years. So I've been in some different places. Now, John and I own the building that we are in. So, yeah, a lot of people just moved around with us. So, 1975 is when I started the Stitching Post. And I remember the next year there was an election coming up for school board. And I thought, I'd never do this in Portland, but I could do that. That could be my volunteer job. And so I ran for school board, and I won. And but when I went to the meetings, nobody talked to me. It was just me and all these men. And it was interesting. I think it was about in the spring when the election was, and it was the next spring. We had, at that time, sisters, high school kids were bused to Redmond to go to school. They'd lost the high school. So there was a lot of people really wanting to have a high school. And, for me, I just felt they had a right to vote on it. I wasn't wanting it because I didn't care one way or the other at that point. But I went ahead and ran for school board, and I knew the structure of a good staff, and we had an incident at the school with a student that ended up getting locked in the basement of the administration building, and didn't find out until he didn't show up for school, didn't show up at home after school. And anyway, I knew that we were going to have to handle the whole situation correctly, or we would be in big trouble. And so I suggested to the board that we contact the State Board of Education, because I'd gone to a conference once I became a member, because I wanted to know what you were supposed to do as a board member. And so we, an attorney came over and worked with us, and and there were no records of this teacher even ever being evaluated. So our school district was probably not in the best shape, and that really bothered me, because I knew we needed that strong foundation. And so and we were just working with an interim superintendent, because our superintendent had moved on to Redmond, was doing a job over there. So we hired somebody, and I said, we need to write up a job description of exactly what we want to have happen. And so we did, and we got a really good person, and we made a policy handbook, did policies and procedures, all of those kinds of things. And, you know, it's still there today. And I feel like that's something that I was able to contribute, you know, to the school district, which was dear to my heart, having been a teacher. So, anyway, now backtracking a little bit, the first year that I opened the store, Kathy Howell had a store called the,
Bug, something?
oh, now I can't remember.
Cubby hole?
Yeah, it was the Cubby Hole. And she had just moved about a half a block away from me on the main street. And she wanted to have kind of a summer festival and put her pottery and all of her stuff outside. And she said, will you just hang some quilts? And I thought, sure, I can do that. But what quilts I had made, the first one I had made is this one that I made when I was pregnant with Jason. And in those days, you didn't know if you were having a boy or a girl. So I just made this little wall hanging, and it hung in his room, and then it hung in my daughter's room once I had her too. And I'm glad I've hung on to that thing. I had made a quilt that Jason had on his bed, and then Valerie had one on her bed, but they drug them around the house. You know, they weren't something I thought was nice enough to hang. And so I called my mom in Redmond because I knew she had family quilts in the cedar chest. So I said, can I borrow the family quilts? So that's how Quilt Show started. I borrowed the family quilts from my mom, and we hung them up. And Kathy had 2 quilts from her family, and then I had the rest of the quilts, and we had 12 quilts. And so, and I had asked some of the ladies in town who I knew had quilts if they would bring a quilt in to hang. No, they didn't want to be bothered. Well, that day, when they came and saw them, they thought it was really a good idea, and they said, well, we'll help you do it next year. So that's how Quilt Show started, and it's a very grassroots event, I would say, and I think we still really honor those early days. And, you know, there's been outsiders who looked at Quilt Show as a way to make money, who wanted us to do things in a different way and become very commercial. And as long as I'm around, I really don't want us to ever get to that point. I think it would take away from the fact that it's a day of sharing, and you can make your very first quilt. And we really try to get first-time quilters to put their quilts in the show. And because I have the store, we see what people are doing. And you really have to encourage some of the first-time quilters because they think their work isn't good enough. And of course it is, you know, because there aren't rules about good enough. So then on Quilt Show Day, you'll see them with their whole family out there looking at their quilt, and that just brings me so much joy. So that's what, you know, Quilt Show morphed into, and it still is today. We now have created situations where we have featured quilters, like if we see somebody that has a nice body of work that's really interesting, or maybe they inherited something and they have some family quilts. But we look for quilts that can be really interesting that maybe people haven't seen around Central Oregon. Years ago, when I saw the very first book that was published about the Gee's Bend quilts, my friend Betsy Menifee, who,
We're wonderful.
yeah, she said, well, Jean, I think we should ask the Gee's Bend girls. And I said, well, how do we know how to get a hold of them? She said, I'll just figure it out. And Betsy just went for it, and she figured out. She called the publisher and got the name of the people that wrote the book and just tracked everybody down. But then we would need to fly them all out here and house them and do all of that. Well, we you were a nonprofit, you didn't have money for that. So Betsy and I raised money and got some people to help us with bringing them out here. And that was such a wonderful event because these women, they'd hardly been out of Alabama at that time. Now they're very famous, but at that time, they had gone to gallery shows when their quilts were in a gallery. And so I asked them, I said, well, would you want to teach a class? Well, they'd never taught a class. They'd never shared what they did. And I said, well, we can set that up. And we didn't know exactly what to expect because it's not like they have a curriculum that's written down like other teachers. Yeah. So we just had to kind of flow with what they did. And so how we set it up was Betsy's brother had a house that he was going to be gone from on the way to Bend, and so they stayed at her brother's house. And then my husband John, we had a van, and he drove them around and brought them to and from. And I mean, he has stories to tell about it too. But what we did was set up a classroom for them, and everybody, no sewing machines, because they did everything by hand. And they worked with whatever they had. And like, here, I have a store of all this new fabric. They weren't interested in those kind of fabrics at all. Mm-hmm. They wanted to go to the thrift stores. So John took them around to all the thrift stores, and they were just cutting up things and taking things apart. And everybody made little blocks while they were in class with them. And these women, when John was taking them back home at the end of the day, they were so excited that they got to be teachers. And
they were just amazing. 3 times they came, right?
Yep. The third time, though, 2 of the women didn't even quilt. I was really bummed out. Yeah, we were kind of tricked. Yeah. But, well, and this, I'm kind of getting off my script.
Yeah, that's okay.
The second time they were here, it was probably 3:30 in the afternoon. Quilt Show's just really winding down, and in those days we closed Cascade Avenue. And so I was sitting on the front porch, my daughter and I, and Ann Richardson, and she was our executive director. And they said, well, Jean, do you want to know what it's like to march? Because, you know, they had marched for Martin Luther King. Uh-huh. And I said, sure. So we all went out in the street and we all held hands and they started singing. I mean, I had tears rolling down my face. And the one gal said, you know, I'm the oldest. And the rest of them would get arrested and then I would just go bail them out. But they, you know, there weren't these negative feelings. It was just what happened. And, you know, I'll never forget just walking down the street with them. It was really special. So, I'm looking at my little script here. You asked me how I became a businesswoman, and it's interesting because I can remember I was just fine working with the public and everything, but then keeping track of everything. And my mother had been a bookkeeper, and you know, I kept track of what my payables were and those kinds of things, and because I always wanted to pay my bills on time. But in terms of planning and a lot of those things, I just did it by the seat of my pants. And then I was divorced in the winter, and it was a scary time because hardly any people come to shop in the winter. And I was really worried. I didn't want to have to move from Sisters. I didn't want to take the kids out of school. And my ex-husband had moved to Alaska, and there was a big dispute, and I wasn't getting any child support. And so I saw a program advertised for small business management, and it was a 3-year commitment through the community college. And I thought, I need this. And I felt like that's going to save me. But I go to sign up and they said, well, you can't be in. You have to be only been in business for 3 years or less. And I said, but I need this. So it took me a month. Every time I go to Ben for groceries, I'd go by the college and try to sign up, hoping there'd be somebody else there and maybe she'd say yes. Finally, they said, fine, you can sign up. Well, I love the class. We met, the whole group of us, there were about 20 people from all over Central Oregon, and we met as a group once a month, and they had speakers and things and worked with us on, how to be a business person. And then we each had a consultant that came to our business and met with us in the business. And mine was Reese Shepard, and he was really a great guy, and he helped me a lot. And one of the things he had me do was to find out where my customers were coming from. So I did a customer survey, and I did it for about 3 or 4 months, and it turned out, when you looked at the big picture, only 35% of my business came from sisters, and the rest came from out of the area. So obviously was a lot of tourism. And I was spending all my advertising dollars in sisters. So, but I didn't want sisters to feel bad, so I still did advertising in sisters, but I really felt like I should be doing something to those other people. And about that time is when catalogs got popular, like LL Bean and those kind of catalogs. And we were able to have an appointment with a consultant for free of our choice. So I chose Peter Skank, who had Mandala Communications. And he had worked with a woman in Eugene that did, she did a double knit business, Stretch and Sew, and he helped her set it all up and everything. And so we got talking about how could we get, some sort of a catalog business going in Sisters. And so came up with the idea of a club, a fabric club, where they would get swatches. And so we called it Fabric Finders, and I had to borrow money for the first, I had a mailing list of people, but to be able to do a mailing to everybody, I borrowed the money from my next door neighbor, and we figured out, what I had to do in order to break even and all of this. Well, I needed 300 people to sign up. Well, I got 600 just like that. And so I paid Kathy back right away. But what it did, it put us out in the greater community, much like the website does now. But nobody was doing that kind of thing in quilting at that point. And a lot of people did it after I did it. But I think I was probably one of the first people to do something like that. And, these kinds of things to me, the way I ran the business was almost like a classroom. I was constantly teaching things or showing new ideas. And I get bored really quick once I know how to do something. I want to go on to something else. And so I was always looking for new ideas. And I think that's part of why the store survived, especially when we had recessions and things. And, you just keep plugging along and finding new ideas and trying to inspire people. And looking back, especially this year after we had our 50th anniversary, I realized from the very beginning, I found an old class flyer, and it said Stitching Post, Education and Inspiration. That was my byline, kind of, and it still is today. And in 1997, I was inducted into the Independent Retailers Hall of Fame. And it was I went someplace in Texas for it. I think it was in Dallas. There was a company that started, had that going. And so, and then it was in 1995, there was a magazine, American Patchwork and Quilting, and it came from, I'm trying to think what the parent magazine was. It was back in Iowa. It'll come to me. Anyway, they picked top 10 shops in America, and we were one of them. And so, well, and this is a picture that of a log cabin quilt that I designed. And at the same time, C&D Publishing in California had invited me to do a book on patchwork. And I made it a kind of starting out with something simpler and getting more complex, but it ended up being 150 pages. And I do not enjoy doing all the math on all the blocks and all the quilts, but I did every single bit of that for this whole book. And then the book was this thick. But it became like the basic textbook for people who were learning to quilt. And it was an investment to buy it because it was a bigger book. And the first ones were hardcover. And then when we did the second printing, they went to paperback.
Was that your first book?
Mm-mm. The very first book I did would have been in '78, and it was called Patchworthy Apparel. And, those early days of quilting, because I had two small children, and I didn't have a room or anything to quilt in, I had the sewing machine on the kitchen counter, and then I would just, the presser foot, which would be on the ground, I would just take and put up on the counter when the kids were running around. And then that's where I sewed. And then I would put it on a table if they were napping or something. But there's something about sewing that has always just filled me up. As a little girl, I wanted to sew so bad. I have my grandma Mita, the one from Redmond, did beautiful clothes for us, all of us girls, and for our dolls. I mean, our dolls would get wardrobes for Christmas. And so finally, when I was 9, my mom said it would be okay if I learned to sew. She didn't like any messes. And sewing can end up a mess sometimes. So Grandma taught me how to sew. And so, I started sewing at 9, and I wasn't supposed to. Mom said I couldn't make my own clothes till I took home ec, and that would have been when I was a freshman. But when I was an 8th grader, I took babysitting money and bought some fabric, and I made this skirt. And of course it didn't have a zipper because I didn't know how to do zippers, but I pinned it together. But she would have just died if she knew that I took it to school and went in the restroom and changed into it and wore it at school. Because the print had ships on it, and I didn't cut it out right, so the ships were all on their side. And I can still see that skirt. I don't know what happened to it.
You were so proud of it, though.
Oh yeah, I was just so proud of it that I made it. But I only took 1 year of home ec because I didn't like the fact we all had to make the same thing. So when I taught home ec, I never made all my kids absolutely make the same thing. I'd always give them things to choose from. Because I figured they can learn the same techniques. You can have different things going. Everyone doesn't have to make an apron. So, now a couple other things. In 1999, Stitching Post was Business of the Year, and that was Sisters Chamber. And I, as a business person, as our chamber developed, there wasn't a chamber in the early days, and I don't remember exactly when it got started, but I didn't want to be an officer, but I was on the board of directors, and I had time to do something like that. But, you know, we really worked with the retail businesses in town to promote us and business in Sisters. And, you know, the chamber today is a different kind of organization. They don't look at the retail community in the same way and as it used to be. And then in 1990, no. Okay, I need to get the right. 2007. I was business person of the year for Sisters. So I have a couple plaques that are sitting at the store about that. You know, it's interesting, I think, when I look back at my life and I see these things now and, oh, you did this or that or whatever. I didn't aspire to do those things. A lot of these things that came my way, I think were because I loved what I did, and I really enjoyed being in this kind of a community. And I had grown up in Redmond, and Redmond was actually about the size of what Sisters is today when I grew up in Redmond. And there's something about small towns and community that I just think resonates even with growth, you know. And, you know, when we had the fire last summer and I looked how our whole community pulled together during that fire, and when I read in the Nugget last week that the Red Cross said they hardly had anything to do because we took care of each other. And I'm just really proud of that. So
We all are.
yeah. Okay. Well, and in 2014, I got to be on Oregon Art Beat. That was quite the experience because they came to my house and they filmed for half a day to do a 15-minute thing. But that's, you know, how they do things. And that was really interesting to do. And so, okay, now it says how I developed as an artist. And I think I always didn't want to have what I was making like everybody else. And I remember when I, in high school, when I was sewing, both of my sisters were really good horsewomen. And I made their cowgirl shirts, and I would design them with a different color up or a different print in the yoke, and then the body of the shirt, and then they always had the pearl buttons and everything. And I was sure they were winning their blue ribbons because of the shirts I made. And I was afraid of horses, so I just did the sewing. But I think that not wanting to be like everybody else really has pushed our business too, because there became a plethora of quilt shops in Central Oregon a few years ago. There were 11, and now there are 2. So it's really interesting. And I remember my very best customer years ago. Her name was Joyce Coates, and her husband owned a paving company, and Joyce, she and her husband would help out with Quilt Show, and she would do like an ad in a national magazine, and she would include me in it, which was really nice. But she and her husband one time showed up with a whole truckload of orange cones for us to use to put out where we don't want people to park during Quilt Show, and we still have all those cones from Joyce. as I, grew the business, and I did a lot of books, and I think that goes back to being a home ec teacher because in those days we didn't always have curriculum books of exact ways you had to teach when. You made a lot of things up, and so I would make handouts, and so books were kind of like doing handouts. So I've done 30 books, and then last year the sisters book. And this one was really hard to do because I'm older, but my publisher that I had for years, CNT Publishing, and they're in Concord, California, they said they would like to do a book about the quilting community as well as the celebration of the quilt show. So I'm just glad I saved all the memorabilia over the years because I was able to sort it out, and it turns out when you the quilt show had not saved memorabilia through the years, so probably everybody just thought, oh, Jean's doing it. So we did that book last year, but back to myself and my growth as an artist. It was when I was 60, and my daughter had started working in the store, and growing up she wanted nothing to do with the store, but she just wanted to be an artist, and she loved photography, and so she went to Pacific Northwest College of Art in Portland, and her major was photography. And she then, after college, went to North Carolina. She had a boyfriend there, and she was having a hard time finding a job, and by that time she had gotten interested in sewing, and I had given her an old sewing machine. And I said, now if you have trouble with the machine, just go find a Bernina dealer. That was the kind of machine she had. Well, she happened to go to this store to get something for her machine, and she saw they had a job opening, and she hadn't found a photography job, so she applied for the job and got the job. And she was around fabric a lot, and she thought, well, I could design fabric, I could take my images. And so she called me and asked about that, and I said, you certainly could. And I said, actually, I there's a new company that just formed called Quilters Only, and through Spring Mills Industries, and I do know the young woman who is heading that up. So I gave her Debbie's name, and I said, you need to put together a really nice portfolio. It needs to be really good. And so she went and showed her portfolio, and she's been designing fabric for 27 years now. Mm. And I remember when I, kind of backtracking, I said to Val, Val, I want to see if I can just make something that isn't from a pattern. It isn't from a block that I already know. And I heard of a workshop up in Washington with Nancy Crow, and that was the kinds of things she did. And it was on, I think it was called Line and Shape in Design. And so a friend and I went up and took the class, and one thing we did, we didn't cut with rulers. We didn't do straight lines. You cut your own lines. Well, I love that because then it's all your own. Nobody else is cutting those exact lines. So, and then she gave us an assignment where we put up fabric or quilt batting up on a wall, and it needed to be 5 feet. And then we had 20 minutes to cut out black shapes to put on that, and they would stick to that fabric. And this is what I ended up putting up. This is it in color, but I did it in black and white first. And the connection here was really startling to me because we had had the big forest fire up on the Santiam, and it was in February. And the day that I left, I was driving over the pass, and it was blue sky day, and here were all these black charred trees, and I just thought of them as they look like ghost trees, so I started calling them ghost trees. Well, when I was in class, I just cut different strips that were different widths, and you can see they're different shapes, and I just started putting those strips up. And I came down to about here and got off my chair because I'd been standing on a chair to put them up. And I thought, well, I need something vertical. So I put this strip here, and I just got the shivers. It was a ghost tree. And it just kind of emerged. And I thought, oh my gosh. And it was so simple. And then she stopped us and said, now you have 20 minutes. I want you to do detail. So I just cut little pieces, and I did all of this here. I think it looks kind of Asian or something. But she walked in the room, and she just pointed her finger, and she said, Pine, you need to do a series. And she saw these as pine needles and pine cones. And I just saw it as getting the assignment done. But I love this quilt because of the experience I had with it, and it gave me confidence to think that I could do something original. And everything I had done before, I was earning a living at, and where I was finally past that stage. So driving home, well, my friend and I, we were each going back to work, and we knew that we didn't have, all day to sew. We said, but let's give ourselves an assignment each month. And instead of trying to think up a new design, let's take something we know and make it a one of a kind. So we picked log cabin. And this is, a log cabin quilt. Okay, here's what I ended up doing. And first I made, just one block, and it was 18 inches. And I thought, oh my gosh, I like this. So then I made 4 of them. And, it can be looked at this way or the other way. And it was probably about 4 years later that I got a letter from the Art in Embassies program in Washington, D.C. And the ambassador to Rwanda was wondering if he could borrow this for 2 years to have in his living room at the embassy. So it went off for 2 years to Rwanda to be in that program, so that was kind of exciting. So in the years since, I think growing up where I have in Central Oregon and growing up in Redmond and Prineville, we did lots of outdoor things. And when we went camping, my dad always wanted us girls to know how to take care of ourselves. He would say, even though you're girls, I want you to know how to take care of yourselves. So, like, we'd cut pine boughs and we didn't have air mattresses. That would go under our sleeping bag, and we knew how to start a fire and put up a tent and do all those kind of things. But I just love the outdoors. And as a little girl, I remember my dad giving me a book on trees so I could identify the trees, because I really loved being able to know what kind of tree it was and so on. But that takes me back to my very, very early years. My grandmother, Grandma Mita, from Redmond. She built a cabin on the Metolius in 1938, and she was single, and she just had the two boys. They were, I guess they would have been in college by then. And anyway, after my dad came home from World War II, he went up and stayed at the river for 2 months. And he fished every day, and he kept diaries. I don't know where they ended up, but I wish I knew. And I was his little buddy, and he would, he made me a fishing pole when I was 5, and he just cut a stick and put leader on it and a hook. And I had to catch my own trout flies. And we had just kind of a little makeshift piece of wood from the shoreline over to a little island in front of the cabin. And I can remember standing there and just looking at the fish and just holding up my fishing pole and swirling around till a fish would, bite the fly. But I also had to kill the fish, and then we always ate them, and so Dad would do the cutting, but I had to do the cleaning of the fish too.
Oh, your picture.
Yeah. So this isn't my fish though. This is one of Dad's fish. But somebody took this picture of me when I was 5 years old. And I just love the cabin, and it's still in our family, and we spend a lot of time out there. And I remember trying to get my two granddaughters that live here and sisters, interested in knowing the different trees like I did, and they just didn't take to it the same way. But we used to play Explorer, and I would do that with the grandkids too, and do a lot of hiking and go exploring for different things. There was a creek out behind the cabin, and in the spring we'd go find the creek. And I think a lot of that has really rubbed off on me, my love of nature. And this is a quilt that I made about 10 years ago, and I call it Metolius, because this is what the fish felt like to me that I would look at. And my husband is an avid fisherman, and he let me know I got the colors wrong on some of them. And I said, well, this is art, Jason. We're not going to worry about it. But I love this quilt, and I made a pattern for it, and we sell them at the store, and we've sold over 1,000 kits for people to make, and it's been going on for a long time. We just make kits once a year, and we usually make 60 of them. And
I have one.
oh, do you?
Yeah, I actually have two. One I finished and one's
waiting. Yeah, this is a quilt that I've done that is more about the basalt rocks. I just am very fascinated by the rock formations that you see, along White's Creek, when you can get down to the creek and walk along the edge outside of Sisters. I just really like those formations. I mean, driving to Bend, we see them, and near the Deschutes River, you see a lot where they're big, giant rocks formations, and I just like those. Again, it goes back to line and shape in that class I took, and what can I do with that pattern that I see there. And I usually trace the pattern and get just an outline of what the shapes are, and then I cut freehand and make the quilts. But this is another one that I did just a couple years ago. Well, actually, it was during COVID, and my husband and I, it was the end of October, and we drove over to Clear Lake, and it was a real overcast day and the trees had lost their leaves. And to me, they felt again like ghost trees, but there was something really ethereal about it. And in the car coming home, I thought, I am going to make a tree quilt. And I had just learned how to machine quilt, and I used a heavier thread just to get all of the little stick-like structures that you see on the trees. So those are some of the kinds of things I've done. This quilt I made, oh golly, it was after my son and his wife got married in our yard, and both of the children have been married in the yard, and we can see the mountains. And during my daughter's wedding, there were a lot of sunflowers, and then during Jason Maggie's weddings, all my white daisies were blooming. And so I designed all of these blocks and pieced them. And this is a similar quilt that I made after I was invited to teach in South Africa at a quilting conference, and I collected some fabrics there. And but when I came home, I was scheduled to teach a class using this quilt block, which is called the New York Beauty Block. And so I just kind of started making some blocks to show the students how you integrate fabrics and things and how you play with color. And I had my pile of fabrics I'd bought on the trip sitting there, and I thought, oh, I could work with those too. So this is, it's called a mafu, and it was made, you know, after I was in South Africa for 2 weeks. So I think that's it.
I think that's wonderful.
I would love to have you tell us though again about your experience with the early teaching when you were pregnant.
Oh, you want me to tell about that?
Yeah. That's very
Okay.
interesting.
Okay, we'll have to figure out how to tie it in. I can talk about early teaching years, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll give a little pause here. Early in my teaching career, I found out that I was a little bit of an oddball at times. After 3 years teaching in the Beaverton district, you were on tenure if you passed. And I thought, well, I wouldn't want to be here if I wasn't doing a good job. I would be embarrassed to still be there. And it was after those 3 years that I had Jason and took a year off, and I went back, and I was at the new school, and I went to my principal and I said, look, I'm not going to sign a contract this year because I don't think this is right. And I said, I want to be evaluated every year. And he said, well, I don't want you talking to everybody about it, then everybody. I said, no, it's just between you and me. And so I just told him I wanted to be evaluated every single year. I would pay my fair share that usually went to the Education Association, but I would put my money where I thought it would do good. So a little bit of a maverick, I guess.
And then being pregnant, how did you?
Okay. Well, when I was pregnant with my first child, Jason, and it would have been 1969, in those times, you weren't allowed to continue teaching after you were 3 months pregnant and once started showing. And there was another woman and we were at Beaverton High School, and she was pregnant too, and we decided that we were going to go to the school board and see if we could get the rule changed. So we, worked on our case and went and presented our case that we felt, we were feeling good and that we should be able to teach till the end of the year. Neither of us were due until July. So they said yes. So Kathy and I were the first ones to get to teach while we were pregnant.
And did they continue doing that?
I think so.
Yeah.
I never paid attention much. I just got what I wanted, so
Good.
moved on.
Well, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was so.
Very good.
Well, I felt like I kind of fumbled around a
No,
little
you
bit.
didn't.
No.
No.
Okay. Well,
I did send her a picture of it, but she didn't necessarily know it's going to be.
well, I didn't go open that.
Oh, that's okay.
And maybe this one also, with your,
Yeah.
your father, the airplane.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay. These are some of the other quilts that are in Central Oregon that I've been a part of. When we, it was, I don't remember the exact date, Wyches Creek was renamed, used to be Squaw Creek, and the Forest Service was wanting to commemorate it in some way. And so our executive director, Ann Richardson, of the executive director of the Quilt Show, talked to them about us doing a river quilt. And we had seen one in a magazine that somebody had done down in California. So what we did,
I think it's 2012.
okay, it was 2012. So we decided the size the quilts would be, and then we put them up on a wall and drew the line where the river went like this. And then when we met, we each got a piece of paper, and our river had to be where that line was. And that's why all of this connects. And my daughter and I worked on one together, and ours is right here. And my sister was living in Prineville at the time. Her name's June Yeager, and she did that one. But this quilt really got some traction. It was an unusual project to do. And I got invited to teach at the Yokohama Quilt Show in Japan. And so I told them about this quilt. And so they had me bring the quilts. And they actually built a curved wall like this. And you walked in the door, and it was in the quilt show was in like a big stadium. And here is our sister's quilt right there. I mean, it was just stunning. And it was really interesting, we had the history of it, a history board, and they did a beautiful job with it. But it now hangs in City Hall, and, we just kept thinking it needs to go someplace, and they were building the new City Hall, so that was our proposal, and they took us up on it. So it's, and at the same time, the city manager asked me if I would create a quilt for City Hall. And so this is the quilt I created for City Hall. And it's in the entryway right outside the chambers. And then my sister and I were approached by the woman who is, used to be the manager of the Redmond Airport, and they had just built a new airport, and asked us to do a quilt. And my sister is I would say an illustrator style quilts. She's always been able to draw really, really well. And in our family, I always thought my sisters were the artists because they could draw horses and dogs and all of this. And I never thought about being an artist, but they're really good at this kind of thing. I'm not so good at this, but June and I worked together on all the ideas, and then we sewed everything together. And this hangs at the Redmond Airport. And we purposely put Dad's plane on here. And then this was the hangar where he created the very first tanker plane. He bought a Navy surplus airplane. I was in 7th grade at that time, and I'm 82 now, so you can do the math. And he had this idea that if he could have that kind of a larger plane where he could carry the product, that you could be up in the air longer to put out a fire. So anyway, I remember when Dad created that very first tanker plane, and they went out and tried it out, and it worked. And
Yeah.
he was very, very excited. But we did some things like our grandma's pharmacy was in that, and nobody else knows those things, but we decided we were putting our own family in there. So it was kind of fun.
And when did that go up in the airport? There's no sign in the airport saying anything.
I
about
don't remember. You know, now I think, golly, why didn't I write down all those dates? I mean, I could go back and probably figure it out.
I wasn't. I looked.
You would know. Just find out when they, the new airport was done. Because that's when we did it, that first year.
Okay.
Thank you.
Wow.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
very much.